Mr. Deardoff, Mr. Blanchard, and myself, your social studies department has thought that it would be prudent to go and look at the founding era, the time period where the United States, under the laws and government that we have today, is developed, because that's going to be really essential for you next year as you become seniors and you take government class. It's also really helpful in looking at our world today with all of the political conflict and debates and tension between not only political parties, but Americans in general, to go back to the beginning and see if that is something new or something old, and whether or not our country is in a state of crisis. So we can talk about that anytime, all the time, whatever. But this particular lecture, I want to take and look at the path that led 13 colonies of Great Britain to decide that they had had enough of being part of the biggest, best, most powerful empire in world history, to break away and strike out on their own in the North American continent, which was remote as far as civilization was concerned. You think about, in our own context, North America in the 19th century is similarly developed in the way that we would look at Antarctica. Kind of like, there are these outposts out there. No one with any kind of money or intelligence is going to really set up a permanent culture there, because there's got to be something somewhere better and closer to home. So what leads these colonies to break away from the best empire and start to develop their own system of government, their own culture and community? So we're going to move pretty quickly here. And in order to do that, we're going to rewind the clock to 1763. And the reason that I'm picking that particular date is that is when the last time we really see the American colonies working with Great Britain for a common cause prior to independence. And that is the French and Indian War. The French and Indian War, that name points to who the British saw as their enemies, the French and the Indians. And the fight in 1763, anyway, was what was considered Western North America, but by our standards today, it's very far east in our own country, territory along the Appalachian Mountains and the Great Lakes region and southeastern Canada along the St. Lawrence River Valley. And I'll have a map up here. If you've forgotten where all of those places are since geography ended, I'll put my map up here in a second. But we need to explore why the colonists decided to fight this war of independence and break away from Great Britain. So in my lectures, I will ask these questions. These are essential questions to understanding history. And so you could take notes over my answers to these questions, as well as concepts and vocab terms that I emphasize both throughout the lecture, and then I will also talk about some of those at the end of the lecture, okay? So in a very quick snapshot of history, the American colonies, I want to kind of personify them as middle schoolers, okay? They were these not yet adult, not yet child, or no longer childlike territories, in the sense that from the time they had been founded, you think about the Pilgrims, and you think about, like I said, other colonies that had been established from 1492 by the Spanish and the French up until we have American colonies settled in Virginia in 1607, and the Puritans and Pilgrims come a little bit later in the 17th century, the 1620s and 30s. They have grown up, and they're starting to have their own identity. And like most preteens, they got a little bit of an attitude and a sense of self-assuredness, cockiness, and desire to do things their own way. And one of the elements of that attitude or that particular personality is this idea of republicanism. Now, today, you probably hear people say, "You do you, boo," or something like that. You do you. You know, this whole mantra that you should be in charge of yourself and that others shouldn't judge you for being yourself. Now, in the 18th century, the popular philosophy that is developing as far as government goes is this idea of republicanism. Now, you probably can relate that to the Republican Party, and that word Republican stems from this idea that government should get its power from the people, from the consent or the permission of those people that are being governed. Now, whether that means a king gets the consent of the people, or in our context, a president gets the consent of the people by being voted into office, those things are being discussed and debated at the time and shortly before the American Revolution. So the American colonies have been experiencing a greater amount of republicanism, or this exposure to this idea that the best kind of government is the government that gets its power directly from its people. Another important element to explaining why the American colonists are breaking away from England, the most powerful nation in the world at this time, is that the consequences of the French and Indian War lead the colonists to experience what they will describe as a loss of liberty. Now, we have the Statue of Liberty. We have the Liberty Bell. We use that term liberty all the time in American culture. But have you ever thought about what that word liberty actually means? So take a moment here, if you haven't, if it doesn't come right to your head, to consider what the term liberty means. Okay? But the word liberty in this particular context means the ability to live freely without some government force or power telling you how you must live. So the concept of liberty, one of the reasons that I'm broadcasting to you via Screencastify instead of talking to you directly in class, is we're going through this coronavirus pandemic thing, and the conversation about liberty, whether the government can tell you to wear a mask, or whether the government can tell you your business has to close down. Part of that, like I said, preteen attitude, this transitional attitude of Americans, as they will become known, is this concept that liberty is the most important thing to American identity, that no one should be telling you how to live your life, right? Unless you are hurting someone else, pretty much you should be left alone to do you, boo, right? So this attitude of the importance of liberty in America, where the population is much less dense, where there seems to be endless amounts of space for people to spread out and own property and become what the British would have assumed was necessary to becoming a full-fledged citizen, which is property ownership and an education and political power and influence. That idea of liberty is at a premium in the United States, or excuse me, not the United States yet, the American colonies. Now, from a practical standpoint, this makes sense. The colonies had to, by and large, run themselves because they were over 3,000 miles away from England. That means with some of the best ships, it would take 6 to 8 weeks to travel across the Atlantic. And so sending messages from the king, from the parliament, to instruct the colonies on how to operate would be impractical. So self-government was necessary. And we'll see each of the little colonies coming up with its own system of government. And while that is nice that everybody gets to do what they want to do, it's also very messy because the 13 colonies are going to have 13 different ways of doing things because each little community is different from the next. Distance weakens authority. The next part is that the colonists over the generations of their existence became accustomed to this self-rule, to being left alone, to having more liberty than any of Britain's other colonies. And so in a way, to use a modern context, they were entitled. They felt like this is the way things had always been done, and that this was the way that American liberty ought to operate. So what did that look like? Well, the colonies were able to tax themselves. They pick their own leaders. Very rarely did the king get involved in the governing of the colonies. The biggest extent that the monarchy had in choosing the leadership of the colonies was giving basically a rubber stamp of approval for who the colonies would pick as governors. And so the colonies really did feel like they had a government for the people, by the people, even before the U.S. Constitution was ever written. So what did Britain do to really, for lack of a better term, tick off the American colonists that would move the colonists from being happy members of the British monarchy to insolent rebels who wage a war and cheat with the French in order to create this new system of government based upon the election of a temporary leader that no one had ever tried before. And this is where we come back to what I had originally said was our starting point, the French and Indian War. Okay? Now, whether it's through popular media like the play Hamilton, or perhaps it's the way that the American Revolution was taught to you in grade school or middle school, contrary to popular belief, American colonists were by and large happy being subjects of the British government. Okay? And when problems first start developing after the French and Indian War, it's not the king that the American colonists blame for their troubles. That's going to come later with Thomas Jefferson's Declaration of Independence. What the first criticism of the British government is that the Parliament, the lawmaking body of the British Empire, is not listening to the American colonists and has no membership within its ranks that represents American interests, no elected members of Parliament for the British colonies. Now, if the colonies had had members of Parliament, perhaps the revolution never would have happened and we would continue to be happy subjects of Queen Elizabeth II to this very day. It's hard to say. But I want to show you, here's our map. And just to give you, again, a geographic sense of what this situation looks like, we could see the British Isles over here. Here's England, Scotland, Ireland, right? And the North American East Coast, where the story of us really begins. And the conflict of the French and Indian War, as I had said, is in this area of the Appalachians and the Great Lakes. And because these regions presented new opportunities for settlement and important resources like fishing rights and the ability to use a boat to navigate to the interior of North America and access fur trade with the Native Americans and all kinds of important agricultural adventures, that became the center for this massive conflict between England and France, who owned territories on the interior, that came to a head in what's in British history is called the 7 Years' War, and what we call the French and Indian War. Now, we're going to skip through that particular conflict, but the consequences of the French and Indian War will have an enormous impact on American history. So this is the first time the British government invests a tremendous amount of money in protecting its colonies. It realizes the American colonies are important assets, and it dumps 140 million pounds into fighting the French. And the American colonists contribute $0 to their own defense. Okay, so this might make sense. This may be fair. If you're a member of a particular country, you expect that country to protect you and to defend you. And the British government did so happily. But at the end of the war, England was in financial ruin. The cost of the French and Indian War had nearly bankrupted the country. Half of the debt that they had incurred in fighting the French all over the globe was as a result of defending the American colonies in North America. And they had sent a massive amount of troops to North America to fight against the French and their Indian allies. So Parliament changes course. Rather than continuing to foot the bill of defending the British colonies in North America, they decide that the colonists should shoulder some of the financial responsibility. Not all of it, but until economic times are better, they felt like the colonies should shoulder 1/3 of their own defense. And what that looks like is building barracks for troops so that they have an adequate place to stay and defend the Appalachian Mountains. Food and provisions for those armies as they're over there long-term away from the British homeland. And this isn't even going to be funded by direct taxes. Like a direct tax would be if you had money taken out of your paycheck. Instead, the taxes that England wants to use to pay for this defense of the colonies, which needs to be done because alone the colonies couldn't protect themselves from the French or the Indians. This is going to be paid for through what I like to call usury taxes. Okay, taxes you only pay if you use a special good. Okay, some of the special goods these taxes were placed on were like sugar. Okay, yeah, one of the very first taxes was the Sugar Act of 1764, which is basically taxing all foreign sugar. So not even sugar that Britain produces, but sugar that England and the Dutch colonies produce. So competitors. In fact, the sugar taxes actually drove down the price of sugar. Didn't matter to the colonists. They were still upset about this. And I want you to think about why that would be. Okay. Taxes on foreign sugar were meant to protect the colonies, and it was meant to protect the sugar trade that the British had invested in. So what's the problem? Why would the American colonists be so upset about a sensible tax like this? Additionally, colonies were expected to build, as I had said, barracks for colonial forces to defend the colonies and to house troops. What's the sense? What's the harm of that? Can you imagine if our military didn't have a place to house our troops? How could the colonists be so upset about a mandate that requires them to build housing and lodging and provisions for British troops that are there to help defend them from their common enemies? Other usury taxes include the Stamp Act. Okay, this is going to tax luxury items like paper, playing cards, legal documents. What else was there? mostly paper products, legal documents, playing cards. And so these paper documents were required to have a stamp to show proof that they had been taxed. And this tax money then would be used for military defense. If you didn't buy the playing cards, you didn't get taxed. So what's the problem with these types of documents? Well, the answer to that is that these taxes were placed upon the colonies without their consent. Now, hopefully, somewhere in elementary or middle school, you've heard the chant, "No taxation without representation." And this is the most fundamental argument for why the American colonies were upset with the British policy change after the French and Indian War. They did not have representation in Parliament, and yet Parliament placed these taxes on them anyway. But it wasn't just the right to be represented in taxing that upset the colonists. There were changes in law enforcement. So not only did the law change, but law enforcement changed as well. The British military was able to go into ships and look to make sure that sugar and paper products carried the stamp of the tax assessor. And people felt like that violated their protection from unreasonable search and seizure. A lot of times, the people that owned the boats that were being used to transport legal goods also participated in the smuggling of illegal goods. And one of the most famous smugglers of the time is someone whose name you're familiar with because he wrote it in enormous letters on the Declaration of Independence, John Hancock. When the military finds out that you are smuggling goods to avoid paying taxes that are in place to help protect them and provide them lodging and support their paycheck, they're not going to be happy, and people are going to get roughed up in the process. So not only are people being taxed against their consent and searched without the proper warrant, but their businesses are going to suffer when their goods are seized by the tax collectors for smuggling. And so the sense that their right to trade and their right to own property has been violated. Eventually, things are going to become such a mess that these court cases that deal with smuggling are going to be sent back to England. And so the colonists are concerned that they are no longer able to have a fair trial and a trial by a jury of your peers because people who are accused of crimes are being sent back to England. The overall climate really matches some of the things that we're seeing in our own society today, where people start to feel like the government is treating them as guilty until proven innocent, as opposed to what has long been our tradition of being innocent until proven guilty. Now, all of these rights that I just referenced, we can find those in our Declaration of Independence, and we're going to do that in our next unit. They are American rights today, but they were English rights first. A right is something that is in place for all citizens. It cannot be taken away, and it's meant to limit the government, and it's meant to protect people from an overly oppressive government, okay? They are hurdles. They are protections. They're like a big coat of armor around citizens who, comparatively to the government, are weak. So it's meant to protect the citizen from the government, which can basically do whatever it wants if it's left unchecked. How did the colonists respond? Well, again, we start to see the American character come out of the American Revolution. All right. Maybe there are other cultures that are more friendly, more willing to negotiate and compromise, and everybody love everybody. But the American character, which is built on this idea of liberty and republicanism, responds in a way that probably sounds familiar too, and that is with rebellion. Okay. Now, that term rebel throughout American history has mixed connotation. In some ways, to be a rebel is a badge of honor, a badge of pride. If you stake it out, you go at it on your own, you are a independently driven, unique figure. In others, when we're dealing with, well, the British perspective, or perhaps during the American Civil War and we look at the South, rebellion is an act of treason against the government. Okay, to go against the law and order of things and to, in a lot of ways, break the law in order to try to prove a political point. So here we have John Hancock. You're most familiar with him for signing the Declaration of Independence first and the largest. He signed it so King George could see his name without needing his spectacles. But perhaps you didn't know that he was also a colonial smuggler. Other forms of protest that the colonists engaged in included noncompliance, okay? Continuing to smuggle goods under the nose of the tax collector. Boycotts were the most powerful, most influential and effective forms of protest. In fact, the British policy changed multiple times, and in some cases, taxes were dropped as a result of the American colonists refusing to buy certain products. So refusing to buy sugar, refusing to buy tea, refusing to buy things that had been taxed under the law appropriately. So writing petitions, peaceful protests by sending letters demanding change were attempted. But more notoriously, mob violence and other forms of violent means of protest were also part of the revolutionary experience. So here we have a nonviolent form of protest, right? We've got some kind of petitioning going on here, right? Today we might carry a sign with our political message. We certainly have become able to post memes and different kinds of things on the internet with simple slogans to tell people where we stand on an issue. But perhaps a step in the direction of violent protests, here are some good examples. Many of the tax collectors, especially in New England, found themselves chased out of their communities. In one case, a tax collector had his home pulled to the ground, destroyed. Another cases, tax collectors were victims of mob violence. If he was lucky, the mob would burn a straw figure or an effigy to show that if he didn't stop collecting taxes, he would find himself in the same position as the scarecrow. In other more extreme cases, tax collectors were tarred and feathered. Now, I know what they show you on cartoons as far as tar and feathering seems like a really silly affair, but you have to keep in mind tar is boiled. It is boiled at a temperature that is above and beyond what is safe for the skin. So to be tarred is to be severely burned. On top of that, tar will suffocate your skin. So whatever doesn't get injured with the initial burn is going to asphyxiate from the lack of oxygen and have to slough off before it regrows. So it's a very painful and harmful form of torture, and it's also a very public form of humiliation because tar, if you get it on your skin, it's going to stain it almost like a tattoo. And so these tax collectors that were tarred and feathered would wear those injuries almost undoubtedly permanently. Here, maybe it's the same teapot, but we have a tax collector being tarred, feathered, and also being given the hot tea treatment, having hot tea dumped down his throat. These kinds of actions were taken by what today we would refer to as patriotic groups, known as the Sons of Liberty. Now, the Sons of Liberty, one of the most famous individuals in the Sons of Liberty was Sam Adams. John Adams, second president of the United States, his cousin, who had been kind of a marginal businessman in the Boston area. Today, there's a beer named after him, even though when Sam Adams owned a brewery, it failed like all of his other businesses. The one thing Sam Adams was successful at was stirring up riots, stirring up controversy. And so these Sons of Liberty were oftentimes the perpetrators of the violent protests or the most extreme versions of protests, whether it was arson or lynching or tar and feathering. Sam Adams was one of the more prominent figureheads of that particular group. Another one whose name you've heard of, but you might not have known his connection to the Sons of Liberty, is Paul Revere. Now, Paul Revere had many sources of employment as well, and most importantly, before he ever did the midnight ride to warn the militias of Lexington and Concord that the British were coming, the most important job he had was as a publisher, okay, a printer, someone who wrote propaganda. And the term propaganda is a political message meant to lead people to one particular conclusion. His propaganda focused on trying to make the British look as menacing, as tyrannical, as dangerous as possible. And without exception, the most famous piece of Paul Revere's propaganda coming from his time in the committees of correspondence was a handbill, a picture of the Boston Massacre, which took place March 5th, 1770. So we'll talk in class here about your understanding of the Boston Massacre, but I mean, shouldn't the title tell you everything that you need to know? Isn't that the way media is supposed to work? The headline is the Boston Massacre. There must have been hundreds of people killed, right? And they were wrongfully executed by the British. And if you can't read, certainly this full-colored handbill is going to tell you all you need to know. And we're going to examine this handbill because it's one of the most famous pieces of Revolutionary War artistry that you can see. And we're going to talk about the Boston Massacre because it might not be what you think it is. Okay. In fact, I can tell you that what you know about the Boston Massacre is actually based upon the propaganda and not about the historical record. But these Sons of Liberty stirred up all kinds of controversy. Here, long before they dumped the tea in the Boston Harbor and the Boston Tea Party, again, actions of the Sons of Liberty. Here they are burning the Gaspee, the British merchant ship that also carried taxed tea on it. So arson, right? And then the Boston Tea Party of 1773 is the most iconic protest led by the Sons of Liberty, where they dumped 342 chests of tea in the Boston Harbor to protest the taxation. It is the straw that breaks the camel's back, as they say, because it's going to be after this event that England takes its most severe form of retaliation, the Intolerable Acts. So this is really where I'm going to draw our lecture to a conclusion, and we will talk about the Intolerable Acts, or Britain's response to all of this protesting and hoopla that the American colonists created between 1763, the end of the French and Indian War, and 1773. So that's one decade, a lot of tension, a lot of conflict that moves the colonies from being loyal British subjects to a group of colonies who declare themselves states and are seeking their own independence. So here's what I want you to think about. Based on what I've told you here, do you think that the way the American colonists responded was an overreaction? Uh, right now we have a lot going on in our country with politics and racial division, and everyone seems to have an opinion on the actions of other people. Is Black Lives Matter overreacting, right? Are the Democrats overreacting to the presidency of Donald Trump, right? Are the Republicans overreacting to demands of the Democrats for more livable wages, the $15 minimum wage, that kind of thing, right? We can discuss these things because they are debatable issues. So I want you to discuss. Do you think that the colonists were overreacting to what the British were trying to accomplish? Okay. And here's something that's interesting to think about. If the Americans had not won their independence, how do you think we would look at people like George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, the Sons of Liberty? How do you think history would reflect on those people today if the American Revolution hadn't been won? Okay, some good conversation starters there. Below are the list of the concepts that I think are most important to this particular lecture. Let me know if you have any questions or concerns. All right.